Welcome. This is a really exciting moment for us to be able to have a discussion which is really close to my heart and also close to the heart of two incredible leaders in the anti-slavery space. To this afternoon or tonight or wherever it is in the world you are tuning in from, we have two people that I hold in high regard as being those leaders. And the first is Professor Kevin Bales, who will be joining us tonight to give us insights into the incredible work that he's been doing over the past 25 years. And also Baroness Young will also be joining us to give incredible insights to the supply chains within the fashion industry that all of us are talking about and wondering how we clean up and how do we use our businesses to be able to create greater lasting impact. And the question we pose is it really possible to be able to use fashion as an agent to be able to change some of the social outcomes of some of the people's lives in the poorest nations around the world? And I think the greatest way maybe to start this is if we turn over to you, Kevin, to be able to just share a little bit about the work that you do and the reality of what it looks like in our supply chains.
James, thanks so much. And great to be here. I haven't been in Copenhagen for a long time and I'm not there now, but I kind of like pretending I am. So let me tell you a little bit about slavery today, because everyone has a picture in their mind of the transatlantic slave trade and the terrible things that happened in the past. But slavery today is a bit different. And it's actually paradoxical in ways that we need to understand. The first is that there are about 40 million people in the world in slavery today. Now, that's an awful lot of people. And when I say 40 million, you think, oh my goodness, what a lot of slaves. But, and here's the paradox, that 40 million is the smallest fraction of the global population of almost 8 billion people. That's the smallest fraction of the global population to ever be in slavery in human history. So in the past, there was a huge proportion of the world's population in slavery. Now we're down to this tiny, tiny fraction, spread very thinly. So it's a big, big problem, which is strangely a very tiny part of our global reality. And likewise, according to the United Nations, those slaves are generating about $150 billion a year in turnover that goes to criminals. Now that sounds like a lot of money, and I know James is hoping Outland's going to go to that kind of turnover soon, but the point being that 150 billion in a global economy of something, wherever it is, nobody quite knows, it's somewhere between 9 and 15 trillion. It's again the tiniest fraction of the global economy ever represented by slave labor. So we have this big problem, which is small, and a big economic impact, which is weirdly small within a global economy. And we also find that the people who are doing the work in slavery that feeds into the supply chains that leads to us represent even a small part of that. But of course, I keep using the word small, but it's huge. It's huge because the human impact is just enormous. We're talking about real slavery, horrific situations in which people are living in sometimes hereditary slavery. And I'm going to be frank and blunt and tell you that if you work in slavery and you're a woman, you will also be sexually assaulted. If you're a child, you may also be sexually assaulted. So we're talking about a horrific and terrible problem. But the happy paradox is that if we take the big view, it's actually small enough that if we work together, we can begin to wipe it out.
Kevin, I read a really eye-opening statistic just with the Walk Free's latest report that they put out, and it said that 1 in 130 women in the world are in slavery. Can you speak to that?
Well, yes, because there are, we've actually neglected in many ways the enslavement of women and girls. There's been a lot of interest and a lot of focus on it since the 1990s in terms of enslavement into commercial sexual exploitation. So when most people became aware of modern forms of slavery, they were thinking about human trafficking into sexual exploitation. But for pretty much as long as human beings have been civilized, there has been forced marriage, control of women, buying and selling of women, children and girls being used in all different sorts of ways, from factory work to commercial sexual exploitation as well. So we know that in many ways, the counting, the numbering, the understanding of women and girls in slavery has never truly been worked through until this recent Walk Free report, which is important. And to give us a really strong idea about how many girls and women are enslaved in the world. Because, not surprisingly, in most countries, women have been denigrated and held to the side, and their problems were not seen as truly important problems. Now we're getting around that, and we're getting to where we're going to focus on that.
Mm. Yeah, very, very eye-opening statistics. It's, you know, 1 in every 130 girls on the planet in slavery. I mean, I couldn't believe that when I read that. Really puts it in context as to how important this problem is to solve, and how actually the fashion industry, employing so many women, has such a big part to play in solving this really big but small and achievable goal of ending this slavery. Lola, I'm wondering whether you could weigh in here. You've got so much experience, in particular with fashion and our supply chains, and share your views on what it really looks like and what you've witnessed and seen.
Yeah, thank you, James. And like Kevin, I'm always delighted to be in Copenhagen, even though I'm not really there. I was really interested in the way in which Kevin put this problem as being both big and small. And I think the important thing to focus on with the smallness does mean that it is achievable to make the change. So this is what we all have to do by working together. And it also occurred to me that in the context of what Kevin has said and what you said also, James, is that this exploitation, this abuse, these awful exploitative and abusive forms of labour are also connected to our ideas globally around race and sex and race and sexism. So, you know, it's really important for me, this is where I've sort of been coming to make those connections between these different, what should we call them, social ills, because there's a level on which it's kind of okay for some people to think that there's sort of black and brown people out there somewhere. Well, they're so poor anyway, they should be grateful for having a job in a factory, even if it does mean working 18 hours a day and being locked in and all the rest of it, because it's better than being sold on the streets, that kind of attitude. And I think we've got to try and dispel that, particularly for consumers. But I think I should say, by way of introduction, that I come from the perspective of being in the House of Lords, the UK Houses of Parliament, as an unelected member, but very much engaged in scrutinising legislation to do with this particular subject and trying to engage both at ministerial level, getting secretaries of state and government to agree to strengthen the legislation that we have and make sure it really has some bite, but also using that space as a platform to talk to businesses, particularly, but not exclusively, in the fashion industry. And that's what I've been doing for the last few years. But I should say that, you know, these problems exist across in every single sector. There isn't, you know, from football to fashion to food is how I like to think of it, is that there is somewhere a problem around this particular area.
It does seem like a big problem. I mean, I'm coming from the perspective of thinking about I have a brand, or I'm working within this industry, I'm managing a supply chain, yet how on earth do I possibly ensure that my brand or the supply chain I'm responsible for isn't a part of this problem? You know, it nearly feels overwhelming, and I've spoken to many brands that feel this way. I mean, they want to be a part of this change, but it just feels like it's unachievable. Kevin, you've done extensive research over the years into the reality of what this could actually look like, and Lola, as you've just shared with us, you know, you've been on the front lines of this. You've been in Parliament. You've been campaigning for this change to happen across our supply chains, and so you're obviously rubbing shoulders with different organisations. We ourselves, as Outland Denim, have been working for 10 years in the space, also on the front line, trying to find a practical solution to this exact problem, you know, enslaved people. And when we talk about these women, and we know that by helping these women, we can have such a dramatic impact on a community as well. It's the fastest way to impact a community. I guess I've seen that it is possible, and later I'd love, and Kevin, you've been doing some work and looking into the depths of our business and the realities there. I'd love you to share a little bit about that. But one thing that we've found is that with really solid research, forming a foundation for our businesses. So we're not going out there ignorantly or making assumptions. It's based off of research like the Rights Lab have put together and others. We are able to make some pretty solid decisions if we're getting our information from these sources in how to set up a business model. And then I see that there's a really important place for government, for legislation to be in place so that there is some guidelines for companies to operate to, some things to look at. I mean, the Modern Slavery Act is a great start for us here in Australia, also in the UK. I think just in educating companies, companies that have never thought about this before have all of a sudden had to think about their supply chains and therefore become educated to the realities of slavery. And I think then that poses a really important question to every human being is, am I willing to be responsible for these things continuing to happen within my supply chain? And I think it's at that point when we question that real change can happen, because to be perfectly honest, I haven't met too many people that want slavery within their supply chains. But then it comes to a practical application. What does it actually look like to gain, for somebody to come out of such exploitation into a prosperous future? I mean, that's the ultimate hope for all of us. And, we have found that building a business model with 4 key elements built into the work day or the work environment has been absolutely revolutionary for our staff. And although we're still a very small company, we've focused a lot of attention onto these 4 things. And the first thing is that we see it as really important to give opportunity also to people who may not get it otherwise. So they may be people that have come from exploitation. They may have been sold for sex or trafficked into another country for labor. They could be just severely poor, which is more often than not the root cause of people being made vulnerable and sold for different reasons. So giving opportunity to these kinds of people has proven to be really, really powerful, but it doesn't stop there. We work in countries where minimum wage is often so much less than a living wage. And that's really going to come down to the brand's responsibility to ensure that throughout their supply chain, that people are being paid living wages, not minimum wages. And understanding the difference is key in being able to ensure that these people are benefited the way that they should be. So living wages starts from the moment when you get employed with Outland Denim, and it should start from the moment anyone is employed anywhere. But then training. So then you're taking somebody who may not have a skill set and training them into a career. And I know that's a big ask. And when we're talking to large brands and we're thinking, okay, well, how do we possibly take all of these exploited people in and train them? They've got no skills, and then still be able to be commercially viable. But what we have found is that when you give these kinds of opportunities to people who have been vulnerable or been exploited in these different ways, you get something else from these people as well. You train them into this job, you make them experts in this job, and you have this loyalty and this dedication to their work, which shows in your product, which means that when you sell your product, you have an edge. But I think there's one last thing that I want to highlight really quickly, is that education is absolutely key in every part of this. So that comes down to you who is listening today to become educated on this, to look at the realities, look at some of the great resources that are out there to understand what slavery really looks like within your supply chains. But then for us in our business model, that actually means applying that to the workday so that our staff are learning. When you educate somebody who's been in a position of exploitation around the most basic things, and you pair that with the things we've already mentioned, you see this most radical transformation in a life. And one thing that I wanted to highlight here is that we run educational programs all the time. And just in September, just with 90 staff, we were able to run about 20 hours of non-industry education. That could be things like finance, which is a really important a topic to be teaching in countries like Cambodia where we work, where there's lots of good and bad debt. And it's really important to make sure that people understand that that bad debt's often what gets them into these precarious positions. 88% of our staff took the learnings through September out into the community. So that means into their family, and then more broadly than their family, it goes out into their community. So just through September, through the educational component of coming to work with Outland Denim, 1,000 or over 1,000 people have been able to be reached. And I think that's a really mind-blowing statistic that can happen from just 90 people. Imagine if that was
Sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to ask you a question, because what you say is brilliant, and that whole sort of ethos that you're talking about. But I'm just wondering, so to me, there's a lot about values and having that as a company and an individual value. So if you can start with that, then overcoming the barriers and the problems and the challenges is not such a big deal once you've decided that that's the kind of ethos you want to adopt. And I think you were saying earlier about some companies being ignorant about these issues. I would say that if companies are ignorant, then they're being willfully ignorant, actually, because there's now so much information out there. And if you're turning a blind eye to it, then how does that align with any company values which you might espouse? Sorry, I just wanted to pick up on that. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, feel free to interrupt. I think that's a really good point, because it comes back to, company values. And I often say that, unless the leadership of any company, unless they have a heart change and they genuinely desire to see these things play out, then it'll never work. It is hard work to follow a supply chain. And the thing with a supply chain, it's ever changing. It's never staying the same. Suppliers are changing their suppliers. And so it's a commitment, which is an ongoing commitment. And I think really it comes down to, and I guess the challenge for everybody here listening tonight is that something you want to be a part of or not? It is a simple question. It does take commitment. But when 1 in 130 girls, and that's a conservative estimation, and that doesn't include any of the males that are caught up in slavery either, are in slavery. I mean, that's a mind-blowing statistic, and we can be part of the problem or the solution, but we've got to be part of one of them.
James, let me add that there's something that we were doing a lot of research on called the freedom dividend. And what we know is that slavery is actually really bad for businesses and for the economy. Slaves don't really consume anything. They do low-level production. If you're thinking very cold-heartedly about it, any society with a high level of slavery, it's a problem, and it actually is a drag on the local economies and on the businesses around it. But you flip that around and you turn those vicious cycles into virtuous circles. And when people come out of slavery, and I've seen this happen in a lot of places all over the world, their communities are transformed. Their local economies spiral upward very rapidly. They often weirdly make more money for the old slaveholders who still own little businesses than they did when the slaveholders held them, because they're producing and putting their kids in school, and they're not there's no child labor, which means the adults get jobs and so forth. Here's the thing that we were excited about with Outland, is that we've been measuring this freedom dividend and really demonstrating how important it is to the economy in those places where the slavery is happening in a quarry or in agriculture or something like that, in rural villages. We weren't doing it with international global companies like Outland. We weren't doing it at the next tier up in terms of production facilities. And now we've done that. And what Outland has clearly shown is that you have the same kind of freedom dividend spilling out all over the place. Kids in school, better health care, lower levels of sexual assault, more taxes paid. I mean, you name it. And it's all coming out of the same kinds of providing those things that solidify freedom in people's lives.
Somebody just...
Yeah, sorry, Lola. I was just going to say, I think that concept of that freedom dividend is just such an incredible way of putting it. When we think about, measuring our businesses and that being one of the measures that we use. I mean, that is game changing for the world. And, you know, I always say we could talk about all the environmental issues in the world, but until we address this, nothing will change. And there's another whole topic we could go into there. I know we're running really short on time. And Lola,
we've got one question. One question's come in about what do we think about the role of the responsible consumer going toward positive social change?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because it's a question that always comes up, and my answer is kind of quite consistent, which is I don't think it is the responsibility of the great mass of consumers, or let's say citizens, to scrutinize and challenge these business models that has produced this stuff. You know, we're particularly in the fashion industry, but not exclusively, we're in a situation where for years now, not forever, but for years, companies have encouraged us through marketing and PR and using celebrities and all the rest of it, encouraged us to buy without thinking about the consequences. And for whatever reason, psychological, cultural and otherwise, we've kind of bought into that kind of concept. So now to suddenly say, well, it's up to you consumers, you've got to make us change, that is not on. The primary responsibility, as far as I'm concerned, rests with government and rests with business, and working hopefully together. Some consumers who have more money, maybe, that they can choose where they shop and can choose to shop, to buy brands that are accord with their values, but otherwise don't put this on consumers is my response.
Yeah. I do agree with you, Lola. I think it's absolutely. I mean, I only did an interview yesterday that was asking this: how do consumers be a part of this problem? And my answer was similar to yours. It's just so confusing, and it's so unfair that a consumer should have to go and research a brand to work out whether it aligns with their values. It is absolutely the brand's job, though consumers have so much power in being able to, for instance, every time they buy a product from Outland Denim, it absolutely bolsters up what we're able to do as far as impact goes. So they do have power in being able to support those brands that are aligning with their values. Absolutely.
There's another question. There's another question that's come in. It's what kind of solutions could be taken to solve this issue as a fashion community? And I'm going to assign that question to myself for just a moment. And the main reason is because you know, it was almost 20 years ago that when research that I was involved with first found slavery in cocoa production, so slavery in chocolate. One of the key ways that we've addressed that and made an enormous difference in that is by getting companies to join together into what was fundamentally a charity, but they all supported it together and they all worked together. Now, they were nervous as hell about working closely together at the beginning. They were all thinking, oh, this is going to be my competition, and we're going to find out about each other's work, and we're going to not be able to compete in the same way. But in time, they realized that they were so much stronger working in a fashion, or in this case, a cocoa producers group, that they could bankroll the work with a small cost to each company, but an enormous impact on the ground. And they could all get their act together. They could start singing from the same song sheet, and they would begin to solve the problems. That's been going on now in the International Cocoa Initiative for almost 20 years. And the transformation in West Africa is really dramatic. So I would say when fashion executives are able to sit down around a table and not be nervous about it, they can bring their lawyers, let them sit behind them if they need to, but then say, how are we going to work together and share the cost and share our knowledge to make this change?
I think we're.
Could I go back?
Yeah, Laura,
No,
I was just sorry. I was just going to say quickly that, you know, I think we're seeing elements of that happening within the fashion industry, which is really exciting.
Yes.
Where brands are willing to collaborate and work together, and in fact, I think, you know, it's absolutely the future, and many brands would see it that way, that as we work together, we're stronger and we are able to share in that impact.
I know we've only got 5 minutes, but I've got 2 questions though. So one is to go back to this idea of the freedom dividend, and whether there's a way for putting that into your accounts so that you sort of, you know, that whole people, planet, profit idea. So you've got triple bottom line rather than just profits. for shareholders. And then the other thing is, I was on a call earlier today about transport and logistics, and it seems to me that quite a lot of brands don't really take into account some of the issues that may arise in that sector. And I wondered if either of you could speak to that.
All I could say on that is that it's a really difficult area to be able to track and monitor. And I mean, we've even talked about having sensors and all sorts of different tech options in our packaging. Like, how do we actually see what's going on or understand more about what's going on? Because we know that, I mean, fishing, for example, being such a huge exploitive industry, and so the logistics side of what's happening, I mean, they're in uncharted territories. So it's I don't know, Kevin, you've probably got a lot more insight there.
Oh, I'm not sure that I do, because it is tricky, and it's such a loose and a lot, and most of the people providing logistics are small outfits linking up and along these chains, and the chains are constantly breaking and reforming. Blockchain's going to be helpful for some things like fish, right? If when you can blockchain mark a tuna, that's one thing. And if you can blockchain mark cotton that's coming from a totally safe source, you'll be able to carry that through. But of course, even blockchain can be cheated in some ways, but it's much, much harder. No, the logistics side's a really interesting one. And there's only 2 or 3 logistics institutes around the world. This is not considered a sexy zone of research, logistics, right? It's like, oh, it's a bunch of trucks and boats. So what, right? But in fact, we need to get interested, because it's not just that. There's the environmental impact of all that transport, and the fact that, everything's going everywhere now. And we've also seen what happens if we can make that more efficient or better, but just by the fact that COVID, in some ways, it's like cleared the air because of all the people who didn't move and all the things that didn't move. And that's been kind of exciting in itself, even though kind of rough too.
Yeah, especially, oh, okay. We've got a slide, yeah. I was just going to say, especially in terms of those factories that have not been paid for orders that were made and then subsequently cancelled due to COVID. But that's another story, a whole other story.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, so this slide's just come up to give us some key notes about what can we do. Who can fashion be a real agent for positive social change?
And look, I think we've all experienced the reality of what can happen in individuals' lives and communities as a result of, if we were to follow this as a practical way of making change within our own companies. We need to focus on quality research. It's just key. Build off a really solid foundation. Don't go to Facebook for your information. You need to find it in places where you can trust it. And then public policy. I mean, my gosh, the impact I've seen here in Australia as a result of the introduction of the Modern Slavery Act has been mind-blowing to me. I think it's just, there's so many layers of good to it. This is a massive step in the right direction. So government absolutely plays a part in seeing the end of slavery. And then the practical application on the ground. I talked to you about if you pay living wages and giving opportunity to vulnerable people, and you pair that with education around the needs that those particular people in that particular community have, you will see massive change. Equip them to be the ones that can be successful in their own lives. Don't hold them in bondage as being the ones that are changing it for them. Give them the opportunities to change their lives themselves. That is key. Partnerships, collaboration with other businesses. It is incredibly important to collaborate. We're in this together. As much as there's competition, I think the days of this cutthroat competition are gone. They need to be gone. We need to solve these problems for future generations. And that slavery can be so small that Kevin doesn't even have a job to research this anymore would be incredible. He's been doing it long enough. And then you as a consumer, I mean, all of us as a consumer, we still do hold power. It's not up to us to make those ultimate changes, but absolutely we can have a say. We can use our dollars to vote. But brands, for all of you that are listening tonight, you're either part of the problem or part of the solution. And I'd encourage you to join in being part of the solution if you're not already. You can't solve everything overnight, but you can take the next step. And you can see some links to our manufacturing, house maker, Outland Denim, our brand, and we've got some statistics there with Roy. If you click on those links, that will show you a little bit behind the scenes for what's happening with Outland Denim. Baroness Young, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for your insights, and Kevin, you're just like always.
That was a lot of
fun. Thank you so much, and
thank you very much.
Thank you to everybody who's joined in tonight. It's great to be able to chat. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.